Our scripture passage this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, and if you were here last week or watched online, you will remember that we were in Luke last week as well, and that the parables that Jesus tells are connected and meant to be understood as a collection. So let us together listen for God's word from Luke 16, verses 19 through 31. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. And even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his fingers in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner received evil. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us is a great chasm that has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." This is the word of the Lord. So like I said, this passage from this morning belongs with the passages we read last week, because you can see that this passage begins in the same way as the passage from last week. There once was a rich man. And while last week focused on the impact of economic injustice on the poor, this week we see the other side of that coin, with the impact of economic injustice on the rich. It's another story about wastefulness, but this time it's the rich man who is wasting his own possessions in his lifetime. And remember, we are in the same block of parables where Jesus is speaking to the sinners and the tax collectors, and the Pharisees are judging him for that. But he's talking about God's value for lost things and for the mistreated among us, the priorities we keep and how we keep them. So there are a few things in this parable that stand out. One is that the rich man is said to be dressed in purple and fine linen, purple being the color to symbolize royalty. So he is making a statement to everyone around him about his own upper class status. And the second part, which I find funny, is that the Greek word that's used in this passage for linens is buso, which in the Hebrew is boots, which is a term that is used to describe high quality Egyptian underwear. So essentially, we are beginning this parable by saying there once was a man so rich that he used to dress like royalty, and even his undies were fancy. It is impossible not to understand that Jesus had jokes. Second, we hear that this man feasted every day. Every day he threw a big lavish party. So not only does this show the breadth of his wealth, but it is also a jab at his character. Because if he is feasting every day, that means that he is not observing the Sabbath, nor is he then allowing his servants to have that day off and that day of rest and that day for themselves with God. Because who's the one that's doing all of the prepping and the cooking and the cleaning for these feasts every day? It's the workers. Third, we're introduced to our new character of Lazarus, who is said to be at the rich man's gate, where he was laid. Now, in the language, again, we're going to get nitpicky, but it's a passive. He was laid there, possibly by friends or family. We learn that Lazarus is without his own agency or control of his situation. He is laid at the rich man's gate. He's shuffled off to places where he may receive aid by others. Now, this could be a really good opportunity for us to consider in our society the practices of how we, at best, choose not to see or acknowledge those in poverty or experiencing homelessness, and at worst, at times criminalize it. Similarly to laws against panhandling or homelessness downtown, when we are on our way to go to the Colts games or the Pacers games, we find a person like Lazarus who's been placed in an area where he's most likely to receive aid due to the high volume of traffic and resources going by. As far as understanding what the benches at these gates meant, I think it's important to recognize that oftentimes those who were rich would have these benches on their homes, and they were there for the poor specifically to receive some assistance. So it's important to recognize that Lazarus wasn't doing anything wrong by being outside of this man's gate. He wasn't loitering. Those were there as a common practice intentionally, but he still receives no aid because it was part of the wealthy's role in ancient world to provide those alms for the poor in the community, which is a good thing, although it was a little bit self-serving because this was what showed them to be worthy of their wealth because of all the good things that they did, and it was their virtuous action. But we don't see Lazarus receiving any of those benefits. Because one, you would think if you were having a feast every single day, there would be bound to have plenty of leftovers that you could make up a plate and box up and could be handed out. We don't hear about that. This food waste issue is one that we also struggle with in society, and I have to admit that I am one of the biggest offenders because portion sizes, if we go out, are big, and shopping sizes, if you live alone, how much celery are you really going to go through before it goes bad? I promise you I will need to work on this as well. So I was looking up this sense of food waste that we have here, and it says, an organization called Rescuing Leftover Cuisine says that while 1 in 8 Americans experience food insecurity, nearly 40% of the food that is processed and produced and transported in the US is wasted, and it ends up in the garbage. That's a huge number, huge number. A huge number that drains our environmental resources, our wallets with inflation, the price of food, and also the workforce that it involves. Transporting, all of that. That's a lot of food waste. And I would imagine that within our lifetime, we will either need to address this level of food waste, or we too will be suffering some deep consequences. And speaking of consequences, Jesus continues in the parable that despite his great wealth, the status of this rich man, the rich man does nothing to ease the suffering of Lazarus. And his plight is so bad that even the dogs take pity on him. Now, these would not be the kind of domesticated dogs that we might think of, that we might keep ourselves as pets. They would have been treated completely differently than how, say, someone might let their dog up on the couch, or let him sleep in her bed with her, or buy glamour shots of them when they went to daycare this week, and fully intend to put them in a frame and keep them on her desk. And she regrets nothing for it. But rather, these dogs in the ancient world would be considered dirty. They were for working. They were not as family pets. And perhaps the rich man kept these dogs as guard dogs for his wealth and his property, or maybe they were just a wild pack of dogs from the street who, like Lazarus, had to depend on their livelihood from the scraps of the street. But we hear that there's something in these dogs' nature that feels empathy for our poor Lazarus, and they try to ease his suffering by licking his wounds. Now, it might be because I am an animal person and people might not agree, but I do believe that pets can be in tune to our body's needs, sometimes more so than even ourselves. A friend of mine noticed a few years ago that her dog started acting a little bit strange around her. He seemed a little bit more protective of her and seemed to be constantly sniffing around into her belly. Well, her dog was the first one in the family to know that she and her husband were expecting to have a baby. Turns out the dog was the first one to know she was pregnant. And I know when I'm sick or when I'm sad, my cat Mika will like to climb up and rest on whatever part of my body may need tending. So it's nice to feel the weight and warmth and softness of her when I have a sore tummy or a sore heart. I will say it is less nice when I have a headache and she will try to climb up and turn herself into a Russian hat on my head. I appreciate the effort, but it's not quite as healing. So we learn that the only relief that Lazarus receives in his life is laid outside of the homes, filled with this incredible resources, and the only relief comes from the dogs in the street. And then both men die. Lazarus is carried away by the angels, and he is welcomed to be at the side of the patriarch and the symbol of the covenant between God and humanity, Abraham. And the rich man is buried on earth. And then he finds himself far, far away from any comfort, something he was very used to in his life, and now he is the one suffering in agony. I like the use of this image of a great chasm. This great chasm between them is really powerful because it represents the physical distance, the spiritual distance, and the emotional distance between the two men, both in life and in death. In life, the suffering of Lazarus fails to reach the heart or humanity of the rich man. And now the rich man, who worked so hard to keep himself separated from others, cannot be reached and cannot be helped in his own situation. He can now do nothing to help close the gap that he created to ease his own suffering. I think a really good phrase that we can tell ourselves, maybe if we've stayed up too late watching TV and we're tired for work the next day, or maybe we got sunburned because we went to the lake or the pool and we didn't put enough sunscreen on, is, well, if it isn't the consequences of my very own actions. But this is a less funny perspective of the same sentiment. The imagery of the chasm between Hades and Lazarus with Father Abraham is so dramatic that it would be easy to make this passage about fear, about scaring us into submission of being a good person. Because we hear about this agony and flames that engulf the rich man. I think it could be used like a theological cattle prod of, you better do right or see what happened to that rich man. Or the Little Orphan Annie poem by James Whitcomb Riley, who tells the children that they need to do their chores and behave because the goblins will get you if you don't watch out. That there is eternal punishment for those who await, who do not obey the laws of Moses and the prophets. And you don't follow them, you won't really know what happens until it's too late. So you better behave. It's an easy trick, and it's been used quite a bit by the church, honestly. But the use of fear as a motivator is not as powerful as we may think. And it certainly isn't a faith-filled motivator or tool. It doesn't even really work in this life. Came across a report from the U.S. Department of Justice that said statistically, harsher sentences and punishments for criminals or people who commit crimes do not necessarily deter the criminal activity itself or its reoccurrence. There are a number of reasons that they give this report. Partially it's because criminals may not know the sanctions for the possible crime. You may know how much a parking ticket costs, but you may not know what something bigger might be. Also, more severe punishments don't restrain individuals convicted of crimes, and in fact, prisons or going to prison for a longer period of time can exacerbate repeat offending. Research shows that prison can create more crime, not reduce. As prisons themselves may become schools for learning to commit crimes, and at its core, I think we can all recognize that a person who may be addicted to drugs is going to take drugs and do whatever they need to get access to those drugs, no matter if the sentence is 1 year or 5, because it's not the time that's informing their actions, it's the addiction. So rather than doing harsher sentences, the report is looking at what actually does work. And that includes a commitment on the part of the offender, treatment opportunities and rehabilitation, and reunification into a community where they are able to contribute and be self-sufficient. That is what drastically decreases the rate of reoffending, and then in turn lowers the crime rate. Similarly, if we see this text as a tool for scaring people into doing the right thing, I think we miss the point. It's certainly worth acknowledging that even in the world, there are some needs that can't be met and others that can. Someone may take the opportunity to step out of a toxic situation, and sometimes others will not. There are things we can do, and there are things we cannot control. Nevertheless, alleviating the suffering of our neighbors is a clear calling for those of us who say we wish to follow Jesus. Our responsibilities to one another in this life are real. Fear may not be a good motivator, but compassion, vocation, stewardship, and gratitude can be. I don't think as Christians we should believe that it is our responsibility to care for the well-being of others out of a fear of eternal damnation, but rather because we recognize that equity is the will of God. Because we are being hit over the head again and again in this passage, the passage we read last week, the ones before it, that relationships to God are more important than money. And so we are charged with using those resources with the understanding that when we do so, we are acting as an extension of the will of God in the world. When we do that, we are not just doing something that is nice or kind, we are participating in the purpose and balance of creation. It means we are holding up our end of the covenant, and that we are working to bridge those deep chasms that Christ speaks of in this parable. Ones that not only separate a man from another, but a man or woman from God. Final thoughts. Legacy. How will you or any of us be remembered? I said it was important that Lazarus is with Abraham, who is the patriarch, because Abraham represents the promise of the covenant to the people. A promise that was said to include descendants that would be as numerous as the stars. For someone hearing this, that would mean to say this is a sign of the strength of one's legacy. It came through descendants. How your name lives on after you die. And this is a question that I think many of us still wrestle with. Now, it's no longer necessarily linked to whether or not you have a large family. In the ancient world, descendants meant survival, not just of your family, but your tribe, your community. That's changed a little bit for us, but we do have ways that we try to do that here in the world. People give money so that they can build libraries or stadiums that have their name on them. We put our names on hotels and towers. There are a million ways that we can try to buy ourselves and our name eternity. But libraries and stadiums, hotels and towers eventually fall. But if I were to ask you the name of a teacher or a mentor who invested in you, who believed in you and gave you the help and support that you needed at a time you needed it most, I bet you would remember their name. If I asked you the name of someone who gave you a break, who saw you past any troubles or doubts that you see in yourself, and who saw and affirmed your value, regardless of age, your race, or status, I bet you would remember their name. How will we be remembered? There once was a rich man, so rich that he dressed as royalty, and he even had fancy and expensive underwear. And there once was a poor man named Lazarus. The one whose name lives on was a beggar. He was part of the invisible poor. Few people would have known his name during his lifetime. Just some dirty, useless man at the gate with the dogs. While the other one, who is unnamed in death, unnamed in this parable, his name is lost to history, despite all that he had in his life and how much of his lifetime he spent being the one to know, who hosted the parties every night. Everyone had to know his name, and he would have been sure of that. But in the perspective of what truly matters, now he is anonymous and unknown. A tool of cautionary tale for those of us still living. Those of us here who represent in this story the brothers. He speaks of his brothers on earth who he wants to warn, but Father Abraham says they have Moses, they have the prophets, and the one who returned from the dead, the one who's telling this very parable that we're listening to. That which serves to refocus the hearers on what we do with what we have, how our vocation is to serve our neighbors. Because virtue is not determined by wealth or type of employment or gender or immigration status or body type. But virtue is born out of deeds rooted in the recognition that we believe in a God who sees everyone, who invites everyone and includes everyone into a sense of equity and well-being. A God who makes it clear that the choices that we make in our lives have the power and the responsibility to enable all to live in health and fairness and to transform this world, to live out our priorities that we profess for the sake of one's relationship with God and neighbor and with the community, both in heaven, but also here on earth. Thanks be to God.